Right now, somewhere in the North Pacific, a mother orca is carrying her dead calf. She has been carrying it for 11 days. The calf weighs several hundred pounds. It has been dead long enough that decomposition has begun. The mother surfaces to breathe, dives, retrieves the body when it sinks, surfaces again. She has not eaten properly in nearly 2 weeks. The other members of her pod have slowed their movement to match hers. They do not leave her. She keeps going. We have a word for what she is doing. We use it carefully, nervously, with qualifiers and asterisks, because using it plainly feels like a concession we are not ready to make. The word is grief. And the reason we resist it, the reason scientists have spent decades constructing alternative explanations, is not because the evidence is unclear. It is because if the word applies to her, then something fundamental about our understanding of ourselves begins to crack. The classical position goes like this. Grief is a cognitive phenomenon. It requires object permanence, the understanding that something which existed no longer exists. It requires a mental model of the future, the ability to feel the shape of an absence, to understand that someone who was here will not be here again. It requires, in short, a level of self-aware consciousness that we have historically reserved for humans and, grudgingly, a small circle of animals closest to us. Under this model, what the orca is doing has an explanation that requires none of that. Mothers in many species carry stillborn or deceased offspring for short periods. It is likely, the argument goes, a misfiring of attachment behavior. The bonding instinct, so powerful and so necessary for infant survival, simply hasn't received the correct neurochemical signal to disengage. The mother is not grieving. She is running an outdated program. This explanation is clean, it is mechanistic, it is deeply, structurally comfortable, and it is becoming increasingly difficult to defend, because the orca in the North Pacific is not an anomaly, she is a pattern. Across dozens of documented cases spanning multiple decades and every major ocean, orca mothers have been observed carrying deceased calves for periods ranging from several days to over 5 weeks. The behavior has been recorded in at least 7 different orca populations across the globe. It is not random, it is not brief, and it is accompanied by something the misfiring attachment explanation struggles to account for. The pod waits, not instinctively, not because they are prevented from leaving. They wait. Adults, juveniles, males and females, moving slowly, staying close, producing vocalizations that researchers describe as qualitatively different from their normal acoustic repertoire. They sound in the documented recordings like nothing so much as mourning. To understand what is happening neurologically inside a grieving animal, you need to understand what grief actually is, not as an emotion, but as a biological state. Grief in the human brain is characterized by sustained activation of the anterior cingulate cortex, the same region that processes physical pain. This is not metaphor. Grief and physical injury share neural real estate. The brain processes the loss of an attachment figure as damage, because evolutionarily, that is exactly what it is. The loss of a bonded individual represents a fundamental threat to survival, and the brain responds accordingly. Cortisol levels rise. The default mode network, the system responsible for mental simulation and future projection, becomes hyperactive, running loops of what was, what should have been, what will not come. Sleep is disrupted. Appetite is suppressed. The immune system weakens. Now consider what we know about the orca brain. Cetaceans possess a limbic system that is, in several measurable ways, more elaborate than our own. They have von Economo neurons, the spindle cells associated with social cognition and emotional processing, in densities that rival humans. Their paralimbic cortex, a region involved in emotional integration, is proportionally larger in great whales than in any other mammal on Earth, including us. The neurological architecture for grief is not just present in these animals. In some respects, it is more developed. But the orca is not the only witness. In Amboseli National Park in Kenya, researchers have documented elephant responses to death that span years. Elephants approach the remains of deceased herd members, sometimes remains they have not seen in months, and engage in sustained investigative behavior. They touch the bones with their trunks. They carry them. They return. In one documented case, a matriarch's family returned to the site of her death repeatedly over the course of 3 years. They were not searching for food. There was nothing at that location that served any survival function. They were returning to the place where she had been. In Botswana, a male elephant named Goya was observed standing motionless over the body of a female companion for nearly 18 hours. He did not eat, he did not leave to drink. When researchers approached, he positioned himself between them and the body. He was guarding something that could no longer be harmed. And then there are the giraffes. In 2010, researchers in Tanzania documented a giraffe mother holding a vigil over her dead calf for over 3 days. She remained in open terrain with active lion presence. She was, by any survival calculus, in danger. The vigil made no evolutionary sense. She stayed anyway. What links these behaviors across species, across continents, across the vast biological distance between a cetacean and a terrestrial mammal is something that the misfiring attachment model cannot cleanly absorb. These animals are not simply failing to disengage from a dead stimulus. They are responding to an absence, and responding to an absence requires understanding that something is gone. It requires at some functional level a model of the world in which that individual existed, and a recognition that the world has changed. That is not a misfiring program. That is the beginning of what we call awareness. We built the category of grief like we built most of our categories, from the inside out. We started with ourselves. We mapped the experience. We named it. And then we drew a circle around it that was just large enough to include the species we could not reasonably exclude, the great apes eventually, and just small enough to keep everything else outside. Because keeping everything else outside is enormously convenient. If a giraffe standing in lion territory over the body of her calf is not grieving, if an orca carrying her dead child across 1,000 miles of ocean is not grieving, then we are not obligated to consider what that experience is like. We are not obligated to ask what we owe them. We are not obligated to sit with the deeply uncomfortable possibility that the interior universe of another species contains something as specific, as devastating, and as recognizably real as loss. But the evidence is no longer cooperating with our convenience. The neuroscience is not cooperating. The behavioral data is not cooperating. And at some level that is harder to articulate but impossible to dismiss. The orca carrying her calf through the gray Pacific for 17 days is not cooperating. Thomas Nagel asked, in 1974, what it is like to be a bat. He was making a philosophical point about the limits of human imagination, that we can describe the mechanics of echolocation perfectly and still have no access whatsoever to the subjective experience of perceiving the world that way. The same wall exists here. We can describe the neurochemistry of an elephant standing over bones. We can measure the cortisol. We can map the limbic activation. We can document the return visits across 3 years. But we cannot know what it feels like to be inside that. And maybe that is the most important thing grief has ever taught us. Not about death, about the limits of what one mind can know about another. The orca surfaces somewhere in the North Pacific. She is still carrying her calf. The pod is still with her. And whatever is happening inside her, whatever the correct word is for the weight she is moving through the water, it is real. It is as real as anything we have ever called by that name. We just don't have the humility yet to say so.